Self-love is the enemy of the God of the Bible. It's the enemy of Jesus Christ, and it's the enemy of the doctrines of Paul from the New Testament as well, and many of the other New Testament authors. And self-loathing seems to be required to become a Christian in the very first place. And that is something that I want to talk to you about real quick today. If this is your first time joining me and watching, welcome. My name is Justin. This is the Bust and Jest channel. And if you're interested in philosophical and skeptical conversations, then do me a favor and subscribe to stay included on the many relevant topics that we're going to address today and in future videos. Also, I have over 100 videos already posted on YouTube as well. So make sure you check those out and don't miss out on the additional history and philosophy and other aspects of religious education that I've been diving into over the last several years. But self-loathing itself is required to become a Christian in the first place. And I mean this both from the original sin perspective, but also from the sort of ongoing sin perspective. And I'm going to share more and more about this in this video. You have to have fear of punishment in order to become a Christian. You have to have shame and regret of your past sins, and you have to have a deep desire to avoid your spiritual death, both your modern everyday sort of spiritual death, and then of course also your long-term, eventual actual spiritual death that supposedly occurs at the resurrection for the final judgment, depending of course on how you view the final judgment. But there's something I noticed about Christianity the more that I've stepped away from it. Of course, you guys know that I was raised in it, spent 37 years in it, and studied it very, very, very extensively on this channel. And one of the really simple things I've noticed now that I've sort of taken a new perspective and a new approach to Christianity is that if you don't have a belief in sin itself, if you don't believe sin exists itself, then you won't have the guilt, shame, and fear of punishment over the way that God essentially made you. And to me, I want to point out that it's really God's flaw if he's unable to create an atmosphere that was suitable for humans to live without dying in the first place. I did a short a couple of weeks ago about this, but essentially we see in Isaiah 45:7 that the God of Abraham says that he himself created light and darkness, and that he himself created good and evil. It says, I, the Lord, do all these things. So if we see that God even admits that he made all things, including evil, and of course, the modern application of Christianity, most would assume and would understand and agree that God did create all things, including the bad things that we experience, then we have to, we're kind of forced to admit that there's a flaw here, that if you want to consider the argument that's being made against you, that you should be fearful and ashamed and feel guilty for the way you are, that there's a very big flaw with that argument because, simply because of God's own flaws. If God himself was unable to create an atmosphere that was suitable for humans to live in without dying, I can't see how that would create why that's my fault. For example, in the Garden of Eden, God created this perfect garden, so-called perfect, that many Christians call perfect. But I challenge that and say I don't think the garden was perfect based on the Bible's own narrative. Of course, when I make arguments during the course of this video and others, we make them from the perspective that the Bible itself has some truth in it and some confusion in it and things like that. So what you can ultimately do is end up showing how if you follow the understanding to its end, the thinking of the Bible to its end, we find very serious problems and contradictions. For example, in the Garden of Eden, God created this situation where Adam and Eve were not only completely naive to all things because they were in a perfect childlike environment where they hadn't experienced any kind of challenges whatsoever because everything was given to them on a silver platter, and they ran around naked in the forest eating vegetables and naming animals. Apparently, in that context, it was within that context that God put this tree with this fruit in it that no one's supposed to eat, no one at all, right? He doesn't want anyone to eat that tree ever. And To me, it's a flaw for even making the tree accessible. If I was a father and I didn't want my kids to get to certain cookies, I would, because they're poisonous and they'd hurt my kids or whatever. I don't want my kids to eat rat poison or something that looks delicious. Then I would put it in a place that's very secure so that my children wouldn't accidentally do it. Whether it was an accident or whether or not my children were doing so intentionally, if I knew that if my kids got a hold of that thing, that it was going to kill them spiritually and ultimately physically, then I would make damn sure that my kids can't get a hold of that product, that rat poison, that food or whatever it is. But here we see God's flaw in that he didn't do that. He made the tree quite accessible to both Adam and Eve. But it gets worse from that. He actually created a serpent. Of course, many of us today believe that a serpent just represents a snake. We hear this, we see and hear this snake motif repeated across all religions, not just in the Christian religion, but across all religions. We see this motif of the snake being the one who gives knowledge and passes on secret and hidden things. But God created this serpent that was more intelligent than Adam and Eve and had a better understanding of how things worked than Adam and Eve do. Especially, it seems the serpent had a considerably better understanding of the way the fruit on the tree worked as well, since he told them, you wouldn't immediately die if you eat the fruit. In fact, you'll be like God if you eat the fruit. You'll know the difference between right and wrong. And on that front, he's actually correct. According to the narrative, he was right about that. It did open their eyes and give them knowledge of good and evil, which is why it was called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So this story kind of supposes that without the knowledge of good and evil, we're all sort of left in this innocence state where no matter what we do, it's considered innocent because we don't know better in the first place. And so long as we don't know better, then we're innocent and we can't really be charged with our sins, so to speak. So we have a garden with limited parameters, with unlimited food options, I should say, but with a very dangerous option being accessible to these naive children who God already knew would have a very difficult time following instructions, since he made them in his own image and he made them to be exactly the way they were. And then we have this serpent who's wiser and smarter than the humans, who God created and sent in to deceive the humans and trick them into eating the fruit anyway, just to disobey him, just so he could kick them out of the garden. And then we have a scene where you see in Genesis, God shows up to confront Adam and Eve about this issue and says, "Where are you guys? Who told you this? Who told you were naked? Did you eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil?" Sort of playing stupid, and playing games, really mind games with Adam and Eve. Perhaps he was testing them again to see if they would lie about what happened. Who knows? But he was kind of playing stupid, and I used to think he was being rhetorical and just kind of using wordplay to make a point here, but I'm starting to wonder if he was simply just not as powerful as he made himself out to be according to the original story narrative. And now we kind of have him under this omnipotent, all-powerful umbrella, but maybe originally the story didn't put him in that position. Of course, Christians now will say there's all these reasons for why God did that. Of course, the Bible doesn't tell you what those reasons are. They're all purely subjective reasons for why God would put the tree in the garden. He has some perfect long plan. The Bible is some long romantic story about his salvation plan, blah, blah, blah. And you can say those things, but the reality is there's not a lot of romance in mass murder and mass genocide. And I'll get to that here in just a second. And that's actually my next point, is that God's attempt to create a sinless and happy existence for human beings and nature in the Garden of Eden utterly failed because of the way he set it up. But not only did that fail, but his attempt to redo it over again also failed. We look to the flood of Noah. In Genesis 6:12 through 13, it says, "And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth, end quote. So this really is an interesting statement to me. I mean, we even see farther on that God says that he repented, that he regretted that he ever made humans in the first place. And I really just feel like this is a really giant lack of power and a lack of foresight. Again, we have this omnipotent idea for God and this omniscient idea also that he knows everything that has happened, will happen, is happening now. That he just has he has his finger on the pulse of every little iota of what's occurring on earth. But I think that we see here that God's foresight was really lacking here. It says, quote, "And the Lord regretted that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart," end quote. So my question is, can you really experience grief over this when you knew it was coming because you designed it to occur? It'd be like me writing a story about what's going to happen, and then when I read about the sad part that I wrote, becoming sad over a fiction that I developed, that I created, that I caused to play out exactly the way it play out. Why was God surprised at all that men didn't do what he wanted them to do? Why did he regret making them if he didn't make any mistakes? That's a really, really heavy point to ponder. Why did God regret making man if he didn't make any mistakes? I think the text proves to us that we are dealing with a version of God that doesn't make mistakes, actually, and the version of God that doesn't is a larger theological idea that's been continued to develop as the narrative develops through the biblical literature. So why was God so surprised when Adam and Eve messed up? And then why was he so surprised when sin amassed over the entire earth? And, the Watchers, they say, mated with women, and there was giants and Nephilim, and everything was, all flesh was corrupted. If you read the book of Enoch, you find out that all the fallen angels came down and supposedly taught makeup and weapons and jewelry and armor and all this stuff to humans, creating nothing but problems across the earth. Why was God surprised that this happened? What foresight was he lacking? Why did he make this imperfect situation? I'd have to say that based on the text alone, that God failed, especially when it comes to the flood. I mean, if you think about the fact that God literally determined that he was so sick of human beings that he was going to kill every single one of them on the entire earth, except for 8, of course, and then some animals. So we're talking about millions, potentially even billions of infant children drowning all at the same time by God's hand because, his plan didn't work out the way he hoped it would work out in the first place. And then so you kill everyone on earth, this mass genocide where the God of Abraham kills everyone on earth to make up for his own mistakes. Oh, I made all of you guys wrong, my bad. I wasn't able to give you the right personality and, inclinations to do my will. I totally messed up and you guys are totally messed up. So I'm just going to kill every single one of you except for a handful. And then we're going to start over and try and make this thing right the second time around, right? But this is where it gets even more frustrating for anyone who wants to just approach the story literally with just sheer logic. If you look at Genesis 12:11, you find out that, as soon as we go through the flood, actually before Genesis 12:11, I should say, after the flood, Noah lands with his family, and he starts sacrificing animals, which is a ridiculous thing to do since there's only so many of them. And, I'm not sure how the polar bears made their way back to the polar regions or whatever, but somehow they magically just got there from Mount Ararat all by themselves without dying or needing food or nourishment or any other animals to eat. They just magically appeared there. It's just a ridiculous idea, really, if you think about it. But on top of that, as soon as they landed, there's already issues. We have a story in Genesis where Noah gets drunk off his ass as soon as they land on Mount Ararat, essentially. And then his son comes in and sees him naked, and it's for some reason extremely embarrassing. Depending upon which perspective you look at, some Christians believe that Ham actually slept with Noah's wife, which would have been like Ham's mom, essentially, because there are motifs in literature and scripture where seeing someone's nakedness can be translated as seeing their wife naked, or seeing their spouse in an inappropriate way, or even sleeping with them in an inappropriate way. And we'll get into that in another way. But regardless of whether or not you believe Ham slept with Noah's wife, or he just saw Noah himself naked, you immediately have sin re-entering into the world. I mean, just as soon as they land in the boat. So you push forward a few chapters, and all there is between the landing and the few chapters is just lineage, and so-and-so begat so-and-so, and families and lineage. And what they're trying to do is give this impression that a lot of time is passing, and years are passing, and then you settle into Genesis 12, and then they finally pick up the narrative speech again, and you find out that, of course, God's sin problem was not solved in any way, shape, or form by killing every single human being on the planet, because sin had immediately come back. Genesis 12:11 says, quote, "When he was about to enter Egypt, Abraham, he said to Sarai, his wife, 'I know that you are a beautiful woman in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, "This is his wife." Then they will kill me, but they will let you live," end quote. So we see that God's murder of millions or billions of people across the earth was completely wasted, since murder and corruption immediately returned to the earth as soon as they landed. Immediately, we have a story about Abraham being concerned that he will be murdered by the people of the earth just because his wife's beautiful and they want to steal her or rape her or whatever they want to do to her. So God's plan to restart and reboot this whole thing completely and utterly failed, right? Fringe Christians will try and claim that it was the hybrid breeding, the Nephilim, and all this that led to this reasoning why God needed to kill everyone or whatever. But certainly we can't assume that every single human child on earth was a hybrid at that point. That would be literally impossible to accomplish. It's just craziness. So my question is, so why didn't God send Jesus to die for the sins of the earth in the first place, if the story of Jesus' death was so critical to God's success in saving man? Why waste time drowning continuously evil infant children all around the world? And I say continuously evil because Genesis says that every human on earth was continuously evil, and that's why he had to kill them all. So the bigger picture here, however, is that through the entire narrative, the readers of the modern age are supposed to feel fear, guilt, and shame as a result of our continuously evil thoughts and our sinful actions. And this story is designed to make the reader feel fortunate that they and their children weren't drowned to death by God, although they deserve to be, right? They'll say to themselves, "I did deserve to be punished like that, but thank God I wasn't alive at that time." Now all you have to do is just believe in sin and believe that death and punishment and all that is resolved by Jesus Christ in order to be saved from all the calamity that's going to come next time. So the next one won't be a flood. The earth will be judged with fire, which is even worse because God promised he wouldn't flood the earth again. So technically he's not allowed to kill everyone that way. So he's going to kill everyone with fire next time is what they'll say. And the only way you can avoid that giant calamity, which is sure to come eventually, according to them, is through Jesus Christ. You have to believe in him and repent of your sins and follow him, to avoid that great judgment that's coming. So to me, this is just a scare tactic. I mean, the whole story, the whole narrative, it's all built up to be a scare tactic for the modern readers in whatever year they were reading it. So this is a tactic that works very clearly when, for example, when we manipulate children to behave in order to receive Christmas presents every year, for example. Like this shows exactly what's at play in the larger sense. Like, for example, let me read to you a little quote that you'll probably recognize. It says, quote, "He sees you when you're sleeping. He knows when you're awake. He knows when you've been bad or good. So be good for goodness sake. You better watch out. You better not cry. You better not pout. I'm telling you why. Santa Claus is coming to town. That's right. That is literally the same message we give to kids every year to try and coerce them into being well-behaved through the year. But how do adults feel about Santa Claus? Clearly, we know that that's just a game designed to create excitement on Christmas, and also a game to coerce throughout the rest of the year our children into being well-behaved. Adults don't worry too much about whether or not Santa is really going to bring them brimstone and put it in their stocking instead of some kind of valuable gifts. Adults know that the whole concept of Santa is an emotional manipulation, both to instill positive feelings in children and to instill negative feelings in children as required, depending on the occasion. I'm convinced that God's presence in today's world is much the same, since it reaches the same ultimate ends: emotional manipulation. Now, I'm not saying that all of it's bad, so to speak, however. I'm just convinced that it is what it is. In some cases, the emotional and psychological release associated with the ideas of lifting burdens, like Christ lifting the burdens off of you, it can be immensely powerful in generating new feelings of self-improvement and cultural belonging, and just really inspire people. That's very, very powerful stuff. No question about that. It was powerful for me too when I was younger. In my opinion, though, it's a greater and grander scale influence of Christianity on society in the first place that creates these, very much of these emotional and psychological ailments that Jesus relieves in the first place. In other words, the pain has been sold already to the American nation since its Christian foundations have been around since 17 whenever. I mean, the fact that sin has infected each person, causing all of us to be involved in all array of sins, and all of us are involved in so many different types of regrettable actions and moral failures. We're all already sure that that's the case about ourselves because we were founded on that very belief in this country. It's very fundamental and core to who we are. Now, all that's left for us to be sold, if you're already sold sin, especially original sin, all that's left to be sold is essentially the remedy, Jesus Christ, right? Obedience to biblical values and hopefully a high-paying deductible church membership will ultimately reconcile all of your personal issues. Not everyone in the church is corrupt morally, though, so don't take that out of context and think that's what I'm implying. I was in the church for a very long time myself. I don't consider myself morally corrupt at the time nor now. I was very, very sincere about my beliefs and my attempt to do what was right there. So not everyone in the church is morally corrupt, not at all. I'd say most people actually have really good intentions. Most of the sheep, so to speak, have very good intentions. But I'd argue that many of them have been unknowingly corrupted psychologically and have been unknowingly manipulated emotionally, very similar to the way Santa Claus is used. So now I have to ask you a question about sin, original sin especially. Does a lioness sin when she kills an antelope and brings its mangled, bloody body over to her cubs just to eat? Does it matter if the antelope also had young ones that it needed to feed? Does it matter if the antelope's family is going to miss them very deeply? Does it matter if the lioness was really hungry or if she was just being wasteful? And I ask that question because cats hunt and kill for fun. That's why many domesticated cats that are left outside with their claws intact in certain regions and neighborhoods are highly frowned upon because they destroy the neighborhood's local ecological balance or something like that. Cats just kill everything. I have an outdoor cat with claws right now, and he's constantly killing birds, gophers, squirrels. He killed an adult squirrel last year. I watched him do it. Just kills lizards, killing everything all the time. So cats hunt and kill just for fun. So my question is, does it matter if the antelope had a moral reason to survive and take care of its young? And does it matter if the lioness didn't have a very good reason to kill that antelope and eat it or just kill it for fun? So humans don't attribute morality, so to speak, to animals at all. They just allow animals to be whatever they are, understanding that they are merely victims, animals are merely victims of their own reality. making the best and most natural decisions for themselves each and every single moment that they live. God made animals that way, is what Christians would say. We don't have to kill so indiscriminately to survive like all the animals do, so we have the moral obligation to make better decisions than a lioness does. Although it's true that humans don't need to survive by killing animals, and so they don't personally do so very frequently, they do it far less than they at least used to, it doesn't remove the fact that humans still kill and eat animals just the way the lioness did. Regardless of the antelope's personal situation, regardless of whatever cow or pig's certain personal situation is, but we're not wrong or sinning by killing and eating, and neither is the lioness. Wrong and sin are subjective and relative values that are ever shifting with culture. For example, the Bible demonstrates this. In Moses' day, it wasn't considered wrong or sinful to buy a permanent human slave, or even to hit a slave, that's in the Torah, or keep your slaves' children when they choose to leave. That's also in the Torah. So in Moses' day, I could buy a female, have sex with her, and then send her away and keep the kids and not let her have them back. Perfectly legal. I could also buy a female slave and hit her. Perfectly legal. Hit her, have kids with her, keep her kids, send her away. Perfectly legal, all according to Torah. In Moses' day, you could keep your slaves' children. It wasn't wrong or sinful to have 2, 3, 4, 8 wives. I mean, King David was said to have at least 8 wives and many more in Jerusalem. Many of today's Christians still argue from the pulpit that this type of behavior that's legal and allowable in Moses' time, in David's time, and in the Torah, today's Christians will argue that that type of behavior is now immoral, and you should not practice that type of behavior, and we shouldn't be involved in it. This is exactly what I'm talking about. Human morality shifts with context and time, and whether or not Christians want to admit that, it doesn't matter. It's proven. It's obvious. The Bible's modern application teaches that we are not to submit to our most natural desires. So instinctual and carnal, for example. So like sex and food, wealth and things like that, the Bible's New Testament says not to go after those things, not to pursue those types of worldly pleasures or satisfactions or whatever, instinctual, natural desires. Ultimately, this philosophy in the New Testament is borrowed from Hellenists and Stoics and Platonists that developed and practiced these same traditions way before the disciple Paul ever wrote a single letter of the same exact words. By the way, please watch Paul or Plato on my channel or read it on my website, because it demonstrates conclusively that Paul stole word for word over and over again from Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and many others. But I'm not saying that there's no sense of fulfillment at all from following these types of Christian traditions. There is a sense of fulfillment that comes from following these types of rituals and traditions. Monks, witches, Mormons, shamans, and Muslims all share a sense of fulfillment from following their own cultural practices. To me, the practice of Zen meditation and the Zen mindset is some of the most fulfilling, personally. But all these practices are only emotional and psychological interfaces. They're just operating systems or learned habits which are designed to tap into a sense of understanding and belonging, to build culture, history, and provide a sense of, inner peace or existential peace, because at least you have an idea of who you are and what's going on around you. But how can I mention nature itself without mentioning 1 Corinthians 11:14? Here's another example. It says right here, written by Paul, quote, "Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For her hair is given to her for a covering," end quote. I've always thought this is such an interesting statement by Paul here, because actually nature itself does not teach anyone that a man with long hair is seen as disgraced, since long hair grows naturally and beautifully on a man. who was made in God's image, according to Genesis. What's natural is what occurs without any interference by mankind. Synthetic would be fake. Natural would be the opposite of that. Naturally, my hair will grow down to my butt or farther, probably. I'm going to find out, maybe. But the point is, Paul says here, doesn't nature itself teach you that anyone with long hair, any man with long hair is considered disgraced, since long hair is disgraceful on a man, but for a woman, though, it's her glory. Again, naturally, men actually do have long hair, unless it's falling out, of course. And it's actually quite unnatural to cut your hair every few weeks to keep it short. If you want to see hair that is naturally short, then maybe check out a man's arms or legs or something, for most men at least. Those hairs are naturally short, but the hairs on our head, Paul, and the hairs on our face for a lot of men, nature doesn't teach us that they're not supposed to be long. It teaches us quite the opposite. So for Paul, though, we can see that his opinion about what's natural in this context here, it actually has more to do with what he thought was properly fashionable within the context of his very own Greek, Roman / Hellenist circles. So you see how morality shifted even for Paul, where he's like, oh, long hair is not good. Why? Because Paul and his buddies all had short hair, more than likely. But we see in the text of the Old Testament, the long hair was actually equated with strength, like in the story of Samson, whose strength was given by God as long as he kept his hair long. Or Absalom, David's son, who was said to be the most beautiful man in the land because of his incredibly long hair. And then even the very first prophet to Israel ever, according to the Old Testament, was Samuel, who was also said to be a priest. And it says that he, quote, never let a razor touch his head. And of course, we know he was known to have long hair because he took the Nazirite vow. And when you do that, you don't ever cut your hair. So for the same reason, some even say that John the Baptist would have also had very long hair because he was also under the Nazirite vow, just like Samuel was, according to the New Testament. So does nature itself teach you that it's not natural for men to have long hair? No, but we can see that cultural concepts have an impact on morality, biblical morality, as the years progress. So at the end of the day, the point to be made is really just this. If we were designed by a single entity called God, and especially if we were created by the God of Abraham, as he is currently represented in the modern Bible, we must admit to ourselves one of two very important things. One, either that we were made by God the way he intended us to be right now. If we are weak, it's his fault. If we're easily deceived, that's also his fault, just like the Garden of Eden. Maybe God should have made them a little smarter. If we use our own sense of rationality, and if we use our own logic, and if we use our own incredulousness to come to the conclusion that God doesn't even exist at all, or at least he has no provable impact on the earth in any known way, if we feel that way, that's his fault. If you want to meet someone face to face and see proof of their capability before you accept a lifelong contract with them, again, it's God's fault for giving you a sense of self-protective skepticism. The other option, of course, is that God, as we understand him, is just simply not all-powerful and all-knowing at all, and he frequently makes mistakes. He changes his mind, and he murders anyone who refuses to trust him on very scant evidence. Of course, there is at least one other option. There is the option to admit to oneself that the simplest answer usually is the best one, and that historical precedence has demonstrated time and time again that the God of Abraham is only one of many motifs that have been transvalued and regurgitated to the masses, not only simply for the sake of just having an answer, but also for the sake of developing a priestly power system. Personally, I can't help but believe that control is really the ultimate aim of this religious system, since the three Abrahamic faiths have so successfully implemented deep-rooted power systems that strongly impact governmental and pseudo-governmental aims, despite the laws around that. I think population control, breeding, marriage, family ideals, and most importantly, our understanding of ourselves is incontrovertibly impacted by our cultural understanding of the Christian God. In conclusion, I have to say that it must be made abundantly and simplistically clear that in order for the quote-unquote spell of Christian mind control to be cast over any group of or individual, which is what it is, if you really understand what spelling is and how spelling works, then you would understand that Christianity is a form of spelling and lesser magic. So in order for the spell of Christianity and the Christian mind control system to be cast over any group or individual, one must first believe that you are dreadfully sinful, evil creatures who've become a disappointment to God and are now destined for punishment. One must believe that since birth, we've been subject to all our own disgusting evil intentions, and as a result, we're severely deficient in the spiritual supplementation that we need to appease an angry God who's coming to judge and destroy most of the earth very soon. It goes back to the future faking thing that I've been sharing about recently. We must believe in the shit sandwich, which, by the way, is a interrogation term that I'll discuss with you at length at another video. But we must believe the shit sandwich that's being presented to us, that the Bible and the preachers of the Bible continue to build around us. For example, Romans Road. If you go down Romans Road with someone in an attempt to convert them, evangelize them, you are building a shit sandwich. That's exactly what you're doing. You're, by definition, building a shit sandwich for them to show us that the only way out of our self-inflicted imprisonment is through the sacraments of the latest iteration of the Dionysian mystery cult, Christianity. We're forced to confront our sin with this belief that only Jesus Christ himself can remedy our afflictions. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, friends and family, I'm pleased to be the one to break the news to you, to anyone reading this or hearing this, that Santa Claus actually isn't coming to town. He doesn't know what you're up to in secret either. He doesn't know when you're awake, and he doesn't know if you are subjectively, culturally, temporarily bad or good. And he has no brimstone for you to put in your stockings if you completely fail this year. I would, however, pay very close attention to Santa's priests and priestesses, though. They seem to have more to do with the acts of Santa than Santa himself. Hey, maybe Santa and Jesus aren't that different after all. That's it, guys. I'm Justin with Bust and Jest. Peace out.